What if I told you that the most powerful moment in any toxic relationship isn't when the empath finally explodes, but when they go completely silent? Stay with me, because what happens next will completely shatter everything you thought you knew about emotional intelligence and personal power. Here's what most people don't understand. When an empath walks away, they're not running, they're not giving up. They're making the most calculated, powerful decision of their entire life. And trust me, by the end of this, you'll never mistake their silence for weakness again. You see, empaths don't leave impulsively, they don't slam doors, they don't create drama. But what they do instead is far more devastating to those who took them for granted. Carl Jung understood this deeply when he explored the process of individuation. The psychology behind this moment is absolutely game-changing. Listen carefully to what happens in those final days before an empath leaves. They become eerily calm, the arguments stop, the explanations cease, the tears dry up. This isn't surrender. This is what Jung called the integration phase, the moment when someone finally accepts the totality of their experience. The empath has finally finished processing every manipulation, every broken promise, every moment they were made to feel like they were too much or not enough. But here's where it gets absolutely fascinating. The empath's brain has been cataloging everything. Every lie told, every pattern repeated, every time they were gaslit into questioning their own reality. They've been building a case in their mind, not for revenge, but for liberation. And when that case is complete, when the evidence becomes undeniable, something shifts permanently. The empath stops trying to convince you. They stop explaining their boundaries. They stop hoping you'll change. And this, right here, this is the moment narcissists and manipulators realize they've made a catastrophic error in judgment. Here's what happens next, and it will send chills down your spine. The empath begins what Carl Jung termed psychological detachment, the conscious severing of emotional bonds that no longer serve growth. But this isn't the cold, cruel withdrawal of someone playing games. This is something far more profound. They're literally rewiring their neural pathways, severing the emotional cords that once bound them to someone who never deserved their light. They start seeing clearly for the first time in months, maybe years. The fog lifts. The excuses they made for you gone. The potential they saw in you. They realize it was always a projection of their own capacity for growth. The love they poured into you. They understand now it was never going to fill a cup with holes in the bottom. But here's the twist that will absolutely blow your mind. When an empath walks away, they don't just leave the relationship. They leave behind an entire version of themselves. The people pleaser. The over-explainer, the one who apologized for other people's bad behavior. Jung called this shedding the false persona. That person doesn't walk out the door with them. That person stays behind like a ghost, a reminder of who they'll never be again. The transformation that follows is what psychologists call post-traumatic growth, and it's absolutely magnificent. The empath doesn't become cold. They become discerning. They don't lose their kindness. They learn to direct it toward people who actually value it. They don't stop caring. They start choosing more carefully who deserves their emotional energy. This isn't about building walls. It's about installing gates with very selective entry requirements. And here's where the real power emerges. The empath discovers something revolutionary. They realize their empathy was never the problem. The problem was giving it to people who saw it as weakness, rather than the gift it truly is. Carl Jung said that the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. The empath finally does this. They learn that their sensitivity isn't a flaw to be fixed, but a superpower to be protected. What happens in the months after an empath leaves will redefine everything you thought you knew about strength. They stop checking your social media, not because they're forcing themselves to, but because they genuinely don't care anymore. They stop wondering if you miss them. They stop hoping you'll realize what you lost. They reach a state of complete indifference, and that indifference is more final than any hatred could ever be. Listen to this carefully, because this is the part manipulators fear most. The empath doesn't need closure from you anymore. They've given it to themselves. They don't need an apology. They've forgiven you for their own peace, not yours. They don't need you to understand why they left, they just need you to stay gone. But here's the absolutely devastating part for those who took them for granted. The empath becomes living proof that you weren't irreplaceable. They rebuild their life brick by brick. They rediscover passions they'd abandoned. They reconnect with people they'd neglected. They invest in themselves with the same intensity they once invested in trying to save you. They become whole again, not because they found someone new, but because they found themselves again. The final phase is what Jung called the return to the self, the discovery of one's true center. The empath steps fully into their power, not aggressive power, not vindictive power, but the quiet, unmovable power of someone who knows their worth and refuses to negotiate it anymore. They set boundaries that aren't up for discussion. They recognize red flags immediately and act on them without hesitation. They trust their intuition completely because they've learned the hard way that it was right all along. And here's the moment that changes everything permanently. The empath realizes that walking away wasn't the end of their story. It was the beginning. The beginning of a life where they're no longer drained by emotional vampires, where they're no longer diminishing themselves to make others comfortable, where they're no longer setting themselves on fire to keep someone else warm. They become dangerous in the most beautiful way possible. Dangerous to manipulation because they can spot it instantly. Dangerous to gaslighting because they trust their reality completely. Dangerous to control because they've learned to be sovereign. Dangerous to toxicity because they've developed an immunity to it. Carl Jung understood that true strength emerges not from avoiding our wounds, but from integrating them. The awakened empath embodies this completely. They don't seek revenge because they've transcended the need for it. They don't need to prove you wrong because your opinion no longer matters. They don't need you to see what you lost because they're too busy celebrating what they've gained. Themselves, their peace, their power, their wholeness. This is what happens when an empath finally walks away. They don't just leave a relationship. They leave an entire paradigm of self-abandonment behind. They emerge not bitter, but better. Not broken, but refined. Not defeated, but reborn. And once you understand this transformation, you'll never underestimate the quiet strength of someone who has learned that the most powerful word in any language is goodbye. Thank you so much for staying with me through this exploration. If you found value in today's discussion, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and share this video with someone who might benefit from it.